ones that I finish. Gotcha. Okay, these are done. I can do these. Yeah, this is the basis so much better.
For sure for you. For sure.
Gotcha.
Good.
Let's go, Josh.
You did your undergrad in Virginia. Did you ever go to West Virginia?
Never? Well, so I'm interviewing there tomorrow. West Virginia University. They're in Morgantown, Charleston, and so yeah, I just Oh, gotcha.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let's go ahead and start. I'd like to begin with prayer and appreciate a volunteer. Thank you.
Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we have to be gathered here together. We're grateful for Dr. Graves and for the efforts that he puts into helping us understand these difficult concepts. Lord, we ask you to quicken our minds and help us to understand these things and know how to apply them as we move forward. We love you and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. Just a reminder that the quiz 4 is due today by 5 p.m. ideally. Also, OIT needs to use this room to upgrade some audiovisual equipment on Friday, just this Friday, and so they've asked us to move rooms, and if I'm remembering right, we will be in 222 across this hallway. That's where we will have our meeting next week. Probably not next week, this Friday, day after tomorrow. So those who are listening who attend on Friday, please note that we will not be in 206, 207. All right. We are in the process of talking about the regulation of glycolysis. This single metabolic pathway, as you are beginning to observe, is very highly regulated. In particular, step number 3, the phosphofructokinase 1 step, has many allosteric regulators. These are molecules that exist in the cytosol that reflect energy needs or energy sufficiency within the cell that determine the rate of glycolysis to a large extent. So let me take us back just a little bit. So we we start with fructose 6-phosphate and the PFK1 step. So this is PFK1 is the enzyme here, converts this into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So I'm going to abbreviate it that way. Now there are those molecules that will increase this step and the overall rate of glycolysis. Those things that are that have a positive or then enhance the activity of this are ADP, AMP, and a molecule called fructose 2,6-bisphosphate. Conversely, this step can be inhibited by relatively high levels of ATP or another molecule, citrate, which is the product of step 1 in the citric acid cycle. We're going to spend some time in the next few minutes talking about this regulatory molecule, fructose 2,6-bisphosphate. You'll note that it is remarkably similar to the product of this step. But this fructose 2,6-bisphosphate does not bind at the active site. It does not interfere with catalysis by binding where the substrate is intended to bind. Rather, it has its own separate site on the PFK1 molecule, and by binding to this site, it has the ability, in a remarkable way, to change conformation and increase activity of this enzyme. So this is actually pretty amazing in and of itself, but to note that there are all of these other molecules that are allosteric regulators that also have separate, distinct, unique binding sites that bind only them, and in doing so, either increase or decrease the activity of this enzyme. We look at ATP as a measure of the overall energetics of the cell. If ATP is abundant, that means that the cell is well supplied in terms of its own energy needs. As a consequence, this step is inhibited, and the glucose 6-phosphate, the step prior to this, is used for either the synthesis of glycogen, or it is converted into 5-carbon sugars, specifically or more frequently ribose 5-phosphate, or into the glycosaminoglycans that involve glucose. So this indicates then, conversely, if these are high relative to this, then that signals the cell that it needs more ATP for health and survival. Consequently, this step is promoted. The product of glycolysis is pyruvate. Pyruvate, in turn, is converted into acetyl-CoA, participates in the citric acid cycle, generating high energy molecules, NADH, FADH2, which provide electrons to the electron transport chain, which results in ATP formation. So this step is extremely highly regulated. I'm now going to switch and talk about fructose 2,6-bisphosphate. Yes?
Are all 5 of those molecules, just wrote down, are they all allosteric
They
regulators?
are all allosteric regulators, and in fact, I've seen papers to indicate that there may be as many as 30 allosteric regulators for this particular enzyme.
So then additionally, ADP and ATP would also be regulators by the Chevalier.
Not for this step, because this is an irreversible step. Okay? But you are right that this step involves ATP. So there is an ATP that binds at the catalytic site. It has high binding affinity, so even a small amount of ATP is sufficient to supply the substrate for this reaction. However, if there's a separate site, a distinct site, which is an allosteric regulatory site, and when ATP levels are high enough, it causes binding of ATP to the allosteric site with a reduction in the activity of this enzyme. So it's complicated. So we have ATP as a substrate, we have ATP as a regulator, two different sites, high binding affinity, low binding affinity. We have this fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, which looks remarkably similar to the product of this reaction. But this comes out of the anthracite, the catalytic site. This does not. This binds to a separate, distinct site on the enzyme and promotes activity. So it gets complicated because of the similarities in these, in the names of these compounds.
Dr. Graves,
Yes.
last class you were kind of talking about how insulin and glucagon also played a part in regulating this
Yes.
step. Are either of those considered allosteric regulators as well?
No, they're not. They are able to regulate both glycolysis and gluconeogenesis by changing the levels of the fructose 2,6-bisphosphate for the PFK1 step. We'll see that they also play a role in the pyruvate kinase step in the liver. Okay, so that's where we're going. All right, so let me pose a question. That is to say, if we have low energy, let's say we have low levels of glucose in the circulation. Let's say we're somewhat hypoglycemic. Would you choose to promote glycolysis or gluconeogenesis?
Gluconeogenesis.
Right, okay, so low blood sugar levels, then you are going to activate processes to promote gluconeogenesis and other things as well, but we'll talk about those at another time. Conversely, if we have abundant carbohydrate and we have relatively low ATP at the time, okay? If we have abundant carbohydrate, we have higher levels of ADP, AMP, low levels of ATP. What would be your preference, gluconeogenesis or glycolysis? Glycolysis. Okay. So let's just begin with this premise. So over here, let me begin with on this side, low glucose, and on this side, elevated levels of glucose. Okay. Hope this will all fit. Okay. So, in response to increased circulating glucose, there is a hormone that is released. What is that hormone? Insulin. Insulin. Okay, so this leads to increased levels of insulin. I'm just going to abbreviate it for space. Glucose, reduced glucose, hypoglycemia, is going to bring about the increase in levels of another hormone. In fact, it's going to lead to increases in 4 different hormones, but 2 of them play a critical role in the either in glycogen or glucose regulation. So this one is glucagon. Okay, so I'm going to squeeze this in. So glucagon's here, insulin's here. All right. Now, there is a very peculiar enzyme that can both produce and remove fructose 2,6-bisphosphate. Okay, fructose 2,6-bisphosphate is this allosteric regulator of PFK1. This enzyme is is bifunctional. It has two distinct activities. They're not both going at the same time, but it has what is termed a phosphofructokinase 2 activity, and it has a fructose 2,6-bisphosphatase activity. This increase in insulin activates a protein called phosphoprotein phosphatase 1, which is going to lead to the dephosphorylation of this enzyme. So I'm going to show this as having a serine that is dephosphorylated. When this serine is dephosphorylated, the PFK2 activity is present and the phosphatase is absent. Okay? Conversely, if I go the other way, this glucagon will increase levels of a protein kinase A, which leads to the phosphorylation of this serine on the same protein. When this is phosphorylated, the PFK2 activity is lost, and the fructose 2,6-bisphosphatase activity is increased. So dephosphorylation, kinase activity. Phosphorylation, the phosphatase activity. So what is the significance of this? Well, with this kinase activity, we are now going to produce fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, which in turn increases glycolysis. Conversely, when we have the phosphatase activity, this leads to a reduction, like this increase. We're going to lose fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, and this will lead to an increase in gluconeogenesis. So it's a complicated system. So this one enzyme has the potential to carry out two separate and distinct activities. The determination of which activity exists or is evident is determined by the phosphorylation state of a serine that is part of that protein. Dephosphorylation leads to kinase activity, production of more fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, and increased glycolysis and actually inhibition of gluconeogenesis. On the other hand, phosphorylation under glucagon's control and indication of hypoglycemia will lead to the reduction in fructose 2,6-bisphosphate. This phosphatase removes a phosphate, reduces fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, which now stimulates gluconeogenesis and inhibits glycolysis. So this single center then is the way in which glycolysis and gluconeogenesis are coordinately regulated. This is under hormonal control. Insulin promoting glycolysis, glucagon promoting gluconeogenesis. Yes?
Is phosphofructokinase 2 related at all to glycolysis besides this pathway?
No, not at all.
What about PFK1?
PFK1 is the target of the fructose 2,6-bisphosphate. So this molecule stimulates glycolysis and inhibits gluconeogenesis at the PFK1 step. And likewise, reduced levels of this actually lead to an inhibition of the PFK1 and a promotion of gluconeogenesis. So, okay, complicated. Questions? Gone through this pretty quickly. Yes?
Is this particularly going on in one part of the body or everywhere?
It has more significance in the liver because the liver is the one tissue that's able to export substantial amounts of glucose. Other tissues do not have that ability, although skeletal muscle has the ability to carry out, it cannot export glucose, but it can produce glucose 6-phosphate. So this is more important, at least in terms of gluconeogenesis, in the liver, although this regulation is present, so far as I know, in all tissues. Other questions? Any questions from people listening? All right, let's move on then to the last step in glycolysis. You'll recall that steps 1, 3, and 10 are irreversible steps and are regulated steps for glycolysis. This, by the way, is in your book. It's not drawn out exactly the same way, but the same idea. And there are a couple slides that comment on this as well. So let's, yes?
I just had one question. So we talked about how fructose 2,6-bisphosphate was an allosteric promoter for the PFK1. Why is that? Because you think that more intuitively there'd be a negative feedback that since you have the 2,6-bisphosphate, you wouldn't want to make more of it. So why is that promoting more creation of it?
It doesn't. So the production of fructose 2,6-bisphosphate is under hormonal control. So when you have high levels of insulin or higher levels of insulin, you do promote the production of fructose 2,6-bisphosphate. It is an indication that you have adequate, even abundant carbohydrate glucose to work with. On the other hand, if you have increased levels of glucagon, that's an indication that you are hypoglycemic, that you don't really want to carry out glycolysis so much as produce more glucose for critical tissues. Okay, we're going to talk about pyruvate kinase, and I'm just going to abbreviate it as such. It converts phosphoenolpyruvate, well, actually, let me put it all down here, ADP, K2, pyruvate, and ATP. In tissues other than the liver, so extrahepatic tissues. This step is regulated by a number of allosteric regulators. For the most part, it is inhibited. So there's a list of those that are going to have the ability to inhibit this step. Among those are ATP, alanine, we'll talk about these in a minute, acetyl-CoA, and long-chain fatty acids. Conversely, its activity is increased if there's a buildup of fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So higher levels of this, product of step 3, promote the activity of this enzyme, encouraging it to keep up with upstream intermediates continuing to produce pyruvate. Okay, so you'll see that ATP is a product, but ATP is also a regulator, very complicated. This is at the catalytic site, the active site of the enzyme. This is bound to an allosteric site elsewhere on the enzyme. But again, if we have energy sufficiency in the cell, as indicated by increased levels of ATP, then we want to utilize glucose for other purposes other than glycolysis. So as with step 3, ATP also inhibits step 10, ensuring that we don't perpetuate glycolysis once we have adequate amounts of ATP. Alanine and acetyl-CoA, high levels of these two is an indication that there's something amiss downstream. Pyruvate is converted in the next metabolic step to acetyl-CoA. So there's something called the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, which we will talk about probably next week, that converts pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is the molecule that feeds into the citric acid cycle. So if this is accumulating, it indicates that you do not have an active citric acid cycle. There are a number of reasons for that. One of the simplest is that we're hypoglycemic. We don't have a molecule called oxaloacetate, which is necessary for the production of acetyl-CoA. I mean, for the production of citrate. So the accumulation of acetyl-CoA would then inhibit this step. If I have a buildup of the product of the next step, that's an indication that I need to curtail glycolysis. Alanine is in equilibrium with pyruvate. There is a transaminase, an enzyme that adds or removes an amine group to pyruvate. Pyruvate with an amine is alanine. Alanine minus its amine is pyruvate. And so if we're accumulating alanine, that's an indication that we're not able to utilize pyruvate. Consequently, it makes no sense to produce more. Long-chain fatty acids, increased levels in those would be an indication that you have activated lipolysis, the breakdown of fats, which happens with hypoglycemia. So again, if we have increased levels of these free fatty acids, it is an indication that we are attempting, well, that we have low blood glucose and that we really need to be converting our pyruvate back to glucose rather than generating more pyruvate. Okay, questions about this? This is everywhere except the liver. Everywhere except the liver. In the liver, this process is under hormonal control. So in the liver, my pyruvate kinase, if it is phosphorylated, is inactive. If I dephosphorylate this, this is now catalytically active. As we saw before, the phosphorylation of the PFK2 the fructose 2,6-bisphosphatase was under glucagon control. So glucagon, well, in reduced blood glucose leads to the activation of the release of glucagon, which activates protein kinase A, which phosphorylates and inactivates pyruvate kinase in the liver. On the other hand, if I have this if I have increased higher levels of glucose, this is going to lead to the production of and release of insulin and activation of this phosphoprotein phosphatase 1, which dephosphorylates and activates protein kinase. So here, this is active, this is inactive as indicated here. So glucagon, a reflection of hypoglycemia, inactivates pyruvate kinase. Insulin, through phosphoprotein phosphatase 1, activates protein kinase, promotes glycolysis. So why this concern about activation, inactivation of pyruvate kinase? The reason is, you recall, that if I'm carrying out gluconeogenesis, I go from pyruvate to oxalo acetate to phosphoenol pyruvate. This requires two bypass steps, the pyruvate carboxylase, the phosphoenol pyruvate carboxy kinase. However, if I do not inactivate the pyruvate kinase, it will immediately convert the phosphoenol pyruvate back to pyruvate. And so I've wasted an ATP here, a GTP here, and I'm right back where I started if I do not inactivate this particular enzyme. And so if I am going to be able to carry out gluconeogenesis, I must inactivate the pyruvate kinase. That is, glucagon as an indication of hypoglycemia is able to do that. Questions? All right, I am going to.
Sorry, Dr. Graves, I have a question real quick.
Yes, sir.
Did you say glucagon will inactivate pyruvate kinase, or does insulin inactivate it?
So glucagon over here, as an indication of hypoglycemia, will activate this protein kinase A, phosphorylate, and inactivate pyruvate kinase. This prevents, so glucagon is going to promote gluconeogenesis, but if I can't inhibit this enzyme, the phosphoenol pyruvate that I am producing as part of gluconeogenesis will be immediately converted back to pyruvate. It will be a futile process. Other questions? All right, let me shift now. Okay, I wanted to briefly point out that insulin is necessary for the efficient disposal of glucose in the body, but it is not the only way in which the body can come to use glucose. And so in this slide, it talks about AMP and the activation of the AMP-sensitive kinase, AMP kinase. And if you go through this slide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but it turns out that exercise actually can lead to the installation of the GLUT4 transporter in skeletal muscle independent of insulin. So if you think about that, that actually is very important. If you think about type 2 diabetes, it is characterized by inadequate amounts of the GLUT4 transporter present in cells. Despite high levels of insulin, at least at the beginning of type 2 diabetes, you have inadequate amounts of the GLUT4 transporter to allow the glucose to efficiently enter cells and be utilized. But what is indicated here, and what science is pointing out, is that exercise allows for the installation of the GLUT4 and maybe the GLUT1 transporter in tissues with uptake of glucose, utilization of glucose, even in the absence of insulin. So what is the significance of this? This means that my brother who has type 2 diabetes can go walking at the mall 3 times a week and actually is able to improve his diabetes control just by getting exercise. Okay? So this doesn't necessarily have to be strenuous exercise. It needs to be prolonged enough that the body then produces AMP and activates the AMP kinase. Okay, this is, I put this up because it is talked about, it is, so we had mentioned when we talked about the oxidative pentose phosphate pathway that we produced initially ribulose, which was in equilibrium with xylulose 5-phosphate, and also in equilibrium with ribose 5-phosphate. You'll recall that the oxidative pentose phosphate pathway produced NADPH, 2 copies in fact, per 1 copy of glucose processed to ribulose, ribose, or xylulose. Well, it turns out that if you have buildup of xylulose 5-phosphate, this actually stimulates another enzyme called phosphoprotein phosphatase 2A. So just to keep it confusing, all of these sound very similar one to another, but this one, this PP2A is now under xylulose 5-phosphate control. The PP1 is under insulin control. The significance of this is that this dephosphorylates this bifunctional enzyme, the PK, the phosphofructokinase 2, fructose 2,6-bisphosphatase is activated, producing more fructose 2,6-bisphosphate. And the consequence of this is that even in the presence of relatively increased ATP, if you produce enough fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, it will overcome ATP's inhibition, and you will continue to produce pyruvate, which is converted into acetyl-CoA. The combination of acetyl-CoA and NADPH leads to the synthesis of fatty acids. That pyruvate, the product of glycolysis, is actually then turned into fatty acids. Put another way, if we eat enough glucose or enough carbohydrate, if we eat both a full pizza and a whole 2 liters of root beer, not diet root beer, but the real thing, that our body will supply, meet its ATP needs, it will produce glycogen, but in the end it will also produce fat. So glucose, carbohydrates, other carbohydrates can be converted into fat under these circumstances. The reverse process is not available. You cannot convert fats back to carbohydrates. So, okay. Okay, we are going to talk now about the synthesis of the glycogen. Okay. Glycogen is a storage form of glucose. It is the form of stored glucose found in animals, as opposed to plants, which have amylose, amylopectin. This molecule is branched. About every 8 to 12 sugars, we introduce a branch on the 6-hydroxyl group of a glucose. And so in the end, the glycogen has the look of a sphere with hundreds, if not thousands, of branches, all of them projected out from a central glucose molecule. Put another way, there are hundreds or thousands of non-reducing ends. We only have the one central molecule that could be considered a reducing sugar. When glycogen is broken down, it is all of these N-glucose molecules that are released. So the significance of this is that you're able to mobilize really substantial quantities of glucose in a very short period of time, because you can have multiple copies of the glycogen phosphorylase, which is releasing glucose molecules from glycogen. You can have multiple copies acting on the same glycogen particle. So this allows having all of these non-reducing ends, all these branches, means that in a very short period of time, you can provide glucose to the organism to keep blood sugar levels healthy and to prevent metabolic problems. It turns out that glycogen synthesis and glycogen breakdown are coordinately regulated. If we are forming glycogen, we will inhibit its breakdown. If we are mobilizing glucose, breaking down glycogen, we will inhibit its synthesis. Unlike lipolysis, which is mostly under allosteric control, glycogen synthesis and breakdown is almost exclusively under hormonal control. And we're going to see the same hormones, glucagon and insulin, providing most of the regulation. If we want to break down glycogen, releasing glucose, would you expect that to happen with high levels of insulin or high levels of glucagon? Okay, glucagon is an indication of hypoglycemia, insulin adequate or even abundant glucose. So which do you need to do if glucagon is up? If you're hypoglycemic, what do you want to do with your glycogen? Break it down, okay. If on the other hand you have abundant carbohydrate, high levels of insulin, does it make sense to break down glycogen or does it make sense to form glycogen? Form glycogen. So keep those sort of general principles in mind as we go forward. The substrate used for glycogen synthesis is always UDP glucose. We'll talk very briefly about its production, but it is always UDP glucose. We saw UDP glucose when we talked about the feeder pathway for galactose. This is accomplished as follows. You start with a copy of UTP, and you start with glucose as glucose 1-phosphate. Glucose 6-phosphate can be converted into glucose 1-phosphate by an enzyme called phosphoglucomutase. And we will see it again when we talk about glycogen breakdown. But you'll notice that this glucose 1-phosphate is going to attack the interior phosphate of UTP. It's going to couple that phosphate that's attached to the 1-hydroxyl of glucose to the interior, to the alpha phosphate of UTP. That forms UDP and leads to the release of pyrophosphate, this molecule over here on the left, right here. This molecule will break down and form 2 copies of phosphate. This is a highly energy-releasing process. First of all, there's the relief of charge repulsion, but now we are also getting delocalization of electron density around each of these isolated phosphate ions. So this is an energetically favorable process. It turns out that the UDP phosphate, the UDP, is a great leaving group. And as a consequence, it's going to allow us to couple glucose to a rather unreactive molecule, tyrosine, the hydroxyl group of tyrosine. This tyrosine is part of an enzyme called glycogenin. Glycogenin is this protein that serves as an anchor for our glycogen molecule. As mentioned, it has a tyrosine present, and the UDP glucose is going to be brought in. The glycogenin acts as an enzyme. It's able to take the UDP glucose and transfer the glucose to the tyrosine. Tyrosine is not very reactive, but this UDP coming off is a very favorable event and allows for the production of this glucose coupled tyrosine. The glycogenin then is going to add an additional 6 to 7 glucose molecules to that original glucose attached to tyrosine. So it continues to act as an enzyme, feeding more glucose molecules. Again, they're all starting off as UDP glucose, but they're all being coupled to the glucose on the tyrosine of glycogenin, and we get out to about 8 sugars coming off of that tyrosine, and now we're far enough out that another enzyme called glycogen synthase takes over and continues to add dozens, hundreds of glucose molecules to this main chain of glucose. In addition, there is a branching enzyme that will bring about, it will introduce these branch points in our glycogen, producing now the fully formed glycogen molecule with all of its branches, all of its glucose. Okay, so recapping, UDP glucose is a substrate. It's produced from UTP and glucose 1-phosphate. The glycogenin binds this couples the glucose to a tyrosine present at the active site. It then, to glycogenin, adds an additional 6 to 7 copies of glucose, each of them beginning as UDP glucose to this initial glucose on the tyrosine of the glycogenin. It acts as this template, an anchor point for the overall glycogen molecule. At that point, the polymer is long enough that it can be accessed by glycogen synthase, which continues the synthesis, and we have the branching enzyme, which introduces the branches present in glycogen. Okay, let's stop there. We'll talk about breakdown next time. Let's have your questions. I'll continue my story next time. It's not really time to finish it today. Questions? So let me just say, you should know, you won't have to draw out this process. You'll notice that there's no electron, well, there won't be any electron pushing that you will need to know for the glycogen synthesis or breakdown. Nevertheless, you should know the steps, the individual molecules that are utilized, how they're produced, the names of the enzymes that carry out glycogen synthesis, and as we'll see next time, glycogen breakdown. All right, I will just stop here unless there are questions. All right, thank you.